Okay. Tutorial take 6. The good part about it is that I'm kind of new to doing this screencast stuff, but the good thing is I've done this tutorial 6 times now, so it's gonna go by bing bam boom now. so, alrighty. So a while ago, somebody asked me on a forum about how to phrase a particular phrase, the basics of instrumental phrasing, and how you can get that in a sample mock-up. At the time, I was severely not wanting to answer that particular question because it was going to open up on a forum just a whole bunch of criticism, which I thought would be counterproductive. It seems to me like everything on this particular forum that I was saying everybody was objecting to, and so I kind of just dropped it. And I always felt bad because it is the basis of how you turn your mock-up into something that's living and breathing. And a lot of people have problems with that, and I'm not just talking about beginners. I'm talking about everybody because there's nothing natural to what we're doing here. Everything is artificial when it comes to samples, and there's no, the players, when they're sampling the notes individually, they have no idea how the music is going to end up. How their sample is going to end up in a piece of music, so they can't phrase it appropriately. So it's up to us as the creator and the sample mock-up artist to be able to interpret our own music in a way that you can get it across to an audience. And that's something that a lot of people don't seem to understand, that you can write a piece of music, you can orchestrate it, you can do whatever you want to, you can even input the notes into a computer, but unless there's a breathing phrase structure, you won't be able to get your meaning across. And and again, it's not just beginning people, it's people that are just super experienced, people that can write everybody under a bus, like Don Davis is a prime example. You hear his mock-ups and they're just dead as a doornail, overly quantized, too short, and they're all wrong. And then you hear his stuff played by a live orchestra, and it's like night and day. And so nowadays you get oftentimes our mock-ups are our finals. They're not just demos anymore. They're making it into even the biggest budget pictures. Have a fair amount of samples in them. What I call fake orchestra. Whether it's because they didn't have the time or whatever. And so this is going to be a tutorial on how do you make your music, sound like it's coming from something, other than a computer. And so I picked this piece because it's a personal piece, but I didn't write it to impress anybody. I didn't write it for a library. I didn't write, it's not that kind of music, but it forced me to it's, I think if I remember it, it's thoughts that I used to have as a kid, big grandiose thoughts about why, there was wars in the world, and, and pleading, praying with God to stop people from hating each other, basically. And so this kind of has, it's very tender and it's very innocent and it's very, kind of a sensitive, emotional piece. But it forced me to really look at how can I get samples to do this. And so here, let me just play you the first 17 bars. Get a little bit of the string in there too. Okay, so the first thing you notice is that um, there is a dual phrase structure. In other words, there's a phrase that starts with one instrument and then gets taken over by another instrument. And that's kind of tricky because you have to start one phrase, it has to peak somewhere, and then the next phrase coming in has to start underneath that main instrument and then take over the phrase. And if you notice, I'm using, let's make sure that, okay, I'm using CC11 and CC1 for the curve. And there's also a fair bit of overlap so that the notes remain connected. Because even with legato transition, if you don't overlap the notes, the cutoff of a note will interrupt the attack of the next note, so it won't sound connected. So you have to sort of, blend them a little bit. And the basic structure of any phrase is you start somewhere, go to some place, and then come back down. If you notice here, I've come back down. I've extended this and then faded all the way out to nothing, just because even with a release sample, the note cuts off abruptly. So you want to smooth. You see that I faded down CC1 in this case. This is with CC11 and CC1. And you get a smoother release. So the attack and the release and the shape of a phrase is what's important. And in this case, the trumpet comes in underneath the horn. And then takes over the phrase, ends the phrase for the horn. Musically, I have no idea why I did that, but it seemed to express what I wanted to express. It's I don't know. There's like a dialogue. Maybe that was the dialogue between me and what I thought was God when I was a kid or something. But and again, and you notice the strings are also still following the same phrasing structure, and it's that they start softer, they build a little bit, and then they come back down in between the melody in the accompaniment. See, the strings come back down underneath the melody. Okay, so that's kind of like phrasing 101. You start softer, you build to some place, and you come back down. And you always have to be sensitive to what is the lead line at the time, and what is the melody line, what is meant to stand out above the rest and what is meant to support. And that's kind of a balance issue, but it kind of dovetails into the phrasing issue, because as you're, starting a phrase and you're building, you have to realize what role are you playing. Are you playing the melody? Like in this case, the trumpet gets pretty loud compared to everything else. And the strings comes back down in their phrasing. but the trumpet also follows the basic phrasing of starting softer, getting louder to a point, and then coming back down. All right, so this is especially important in a tutti when you're doing forte, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard pieces where they're just loud and it's just the same, dynamic from beginning to end, including me. I'm guilty of this too, but so here in this tutti section, you'll notice something quite different as well. Okay, so this one's a little bit more complicated in structure, phrasing-wise. And I honestly cannot hear this without crying, just because it's such a personal piece to me. But anyways, what I needed to get was the idea of that there was a phrase within a phrase, and that it was breathing even though it was all loud. And if you notice the violin, the main phrase is an 8-bar phrase. But if you notice, there's peaks also within the phrase. Like if I were to draw the straight line from the beginning, you would notice that there's a gradual crescendo and then a diminuendo all the way down to nothing. But within that gradual crescendo and diminuendo, there's what I call breathing, and it comes up and it goes down, and within the overall, so it's like a dual structured expression. There's the overall length of the phrase, starting softer, getting louder, and then coming back down. But there's also within that peaks and valleys. And so you get this phrase that sounds perfectly natural but looks completely convoluted on the screen. And I had a teacher once who used to tell me that everything is a drop in the bucket, but if you put enough drops in that bucket, it makes a big difference. And if you notice that if I had done this completely straight, kind of how unnatural it would sound. And let's see if I can, I don't want to solo it particularly, but all right, did you notice that it lost its yearning? It's like in my mind it was like a pleading, and the whole piece is really about pleading, and then this is just like the final sort of kind of almost rage in pleading, but it lost its sense of it, that it was breathing, because there was no peaks and valleys within the overall contour of the phrase. So if I put it back, you'll notice that the piece kind of yearns. It kind of, I solo something, I lose my voice, but I'll solo it for you so you can hear the real. Okay, so you get the idea. Okay, this idea is very basic. You start someplace, usually a little softer than where you peak at, and then you come away from that peak. Within that peak, there can be, valleys, just like a mountain. Just as it comes up, you might have some places that are flat, some places that go down, but the general ascent is one that is going from lower to higher and then back down again. And that's kind of the basics of phrasing. And it's also, it's a very simple idea, but it has the ramifications go throughout all of music. It encompasses what I consider sort of a top layer of musical expression. And that is, how do you get your sounds and your notes from being just a mathematical or a sonic quality to something that really goes across to an audience? Hans Zimmer is probably one of the best at using what he calls, I think, envelopes, because I heard him speaking about it once, and even though he does use terms like dynamics, and he's very smart actually, but he thinks of it as an envelope. I could tell that he thinks of it as, there's an envelope with a slower attack and then it builds. When he speaks, I can tell that he's thinking that way. For more traditionally trained composers, it's, I consider it more of a dynamic within a dynamic in expression. You may be forte, like in this violin example, or this tutti example. Everything's forte, but everything's got a, is breathing. It's not just a static forte. There's ups and downs within the forte, you know what I'm saying? This is more like a mezzo forte, but here, like, you get like it's a fully loud, but there's a sign going. So you get that sort of control over the expression, and that's the carrier wave that brings music from you to your audience. And a lot of composers miss that step. A lot of composers, for some reason, more so than in the past, don't have experience with playing an instrument at any particular level. And so they miss that sort of, it's the players that bring your music to life. Now, if you're doing a mock-up, you're all the players. And it took me a long time to understand that, just because I knew about orchestration and I knew about, how to compose a melody and how to put together a phrase technically. For some reason, it took me in the computer realm a long time to sort of apply my performance skills to it, so that I could actually bring it out of the computer and people would actually respond to it. And this piece actually did get some pretty good response. Not too many people have heard it, but compared to some of my other stuff, but it did get some good response, that people really did get it. And so that's what it is. Like I said, the ramifications of phrasing go from playing two notes together to an entire piece, and that's the scope of it. And it's hard to explain all the ramifications, but that's the basic of it. Is you start softer, you build to some place, and then you come back down. And within that overall structure, there can be little peaks and valleys, what people call breathing or expression. To do that with samples, I use CC1 or CC11 or a combination of both, depending on how the library is programmed. And not every library is programmed the same. I know for for Hollywood strings, CC11 is the kind of the main dynamic crossfade where you can choose your dynamic level and your expression as well. They've kind of programmed that pretty well. But in every other library that I have, including Hollywood Brass, you have to use both CC1 and CC11, and you got to get very good at restraining yourself, because it's easy to go from piano to double forte and in the blink of an eye, and you got to sort of feel like by ear what's the best expression for your particular phrase. All right, take care.